Let's return now to our top story, where more than half the population of England is now subject to tighter coronavirus restrictions. And there's still bitter disagreement about areas, particularly in the north, facing the toughest Tier 3 measures. There are concerns that many businesses will be unable to recover this time around. Well, let's go live to Cambridge, where we can talk to Flavio Toxved, a specialist in the economics of the infectious diseases at the University of Cambridge. My apologies, your name threw me a little bit there, but I hope I didn't destroy it too much. Listen, we're talking, of course, about all of the restrictions and kind of sort of patchwork that we've now got across the UK. And I'm interested in whether or not you think this targeted approach is the right one.
Thank you for having me on. It's fine with the name.
Good.
So these targeted restrictions, in some sense, are the inevitable consequence of the experience we had in March and April, which was the complete lockdown, which did, of course, did a lot to stem the spread of the disease, but it also did a lot of damage, not just to the economy, but to society as a whole. And so there was an understanding over time that we could probably not, or at least not as a first measure, return to these very draconian across-the-board restrictions. And so it's only right that we now start experimenting, in some sense, with more targeted lockdowns. What we're seeing now, of course, is the consequence of not knowing all the parameters of the problem we're facing. We are in unprecedented times in terms of infection control and in terms of managing the economy. And so I think even though there's a consensus that targeted policies might be the right way to go, we still don't fully understand what are the right way of designing these things. And so inevitably, there are going to be situations where things might look slightly arbitrary or where people might not agree with these restrictions. But I think to just take one step back, if you see the resistance that has been, for example, by Andy Burnham and others in the north, the objections are not against local restrictions. I think everybody recognizes that something needs to be done. What the disagreement is about is whether there is going to be transfers from central government to back up those local restrictions to, in some sense, cushion the economic fallout from these local restrictions. So I think really this is a discussion more about money than about imposing local restrictions in order to curb the spread of the infection.
It's interesting you talk about the resistance coming from Andy Burnham specifically, and that he's not opposed to the idea of increased measures. But by flagging the issue that he does have, which comes down to money, he is delaying the imposition of those further measures. And isn't he thereby, risking his community's health in that way?
You can say that, but by the same token, you can say that in order for a policy to be effective, it needs local buy-in. It needs local support in order to be well implemented. Now, if there's strong feeling in the north that their grievances or their economic troubles are not taken into account, you might experience a situation where it's imposed centrally by government. Of course, ministers have all the right in the world to impose these restrictions, but if there's not proper local collaboration with these policies, you may have a weaker buy-in and a weaker compliance overall, which makes it more difficult to curb the infection. So it goes both ways.
Look, and the truth is, I suppose, that there are always going to be losers, whatever decision that the government opts for. Look, we've been discussing this morning the idea of the circuit breaker. We're seeing it being implemented in Northern Ireland, for example. Lots of people arguing that it gives us a chance to get our test and trace up and running. And I just wanted to ask whether or not you think that is a possibility, or if you think it is too late, really, to try and tackle the virus with test and trace.
So it seems that test and trace is an integral part of a strategy to combat disease. I think there's no doubt about that now. Now, the question then becomes whether the circuit breaker policy is the right way to go. And I like to think of the circuit breaker really as an emergency brake. If you need to use that kind of measures, is an open admission that the control measures that were there beforehand were really not doing the intended, or rather doing the kind of lifting that you would have expected. Now, in terms of using a circuit breaker for improving the test and trace capacity, now, if you think that you can accomplish within a 2-week circuit break what you haven't been able to do over the previous few months, then I think you're kind of very optimistic about what this can buy us. So I'm by no means saying we shouldn't have circuit breakers, but I think we have to have a strategy in place for what happens afterwards. It's going to buy us a bit of time, but this time really needs to be used very, very carefully. Otherwise, we're going to be in cycles of shutting down and closing down, opening up and closing down forever, and which is massively destructive for society and for the economy.
OK, Flavio Tux there. Really interesting to talk to you, specialist in the economics of infectious diseases at the University of Cambridge. Thank you.
Thank you.
This is Sky News. Coming up after the break, a rock star